Dear learners, welcome to the MOOC course on environmental sociology. My name is Arjun Sengupta. I'm an assistant professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad. In today's session, we shall discuss what is called environmental justice. Our learning objectives will be threefold. Firstly, to understand the background, context and character of environmental justice as an environmental perspective. Second, to understand the principles that underpin environmental justice. And third, to be familiar with a few cases of environmental injustice from around the world. Each of these objectives will be addressed in a separate session. In the first session, we will take up the first objective, which is to understand the background, context and character of environmental justice as a perspective. In the first part, we will look at the background, context and character of environmental justice. Coming together of environmental and social justice movements. In the earlier environmental movement, the stress was on preservation or conservation of nature. This led to movements in countries like the United States to preserve forests, wildernesses, etc. In the 1960s, with the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the attention shifted to pollution of different forms. However, these movements did not connect environmental questions to questions of social equity. Parallelly, the 1950s and 60s saw powerful movements challenging racial oppression, particularly in the United States. In a way, the rise of environmental justice movements represents a coming together of these two strands of social movements. The perspective seeks to connect questions of environmental degradation with issues of social inequity and injustice. So for the first time, you had people trying to link up the question of social inequality, of social injustice with the question of environmental protection. And it is in this single fact that most of the importance of environmental justice as a paradigm lies. Now, to understand where the idea of environmental justice came, there is this one particular idea of environmental racism which emerges in the early 1980s, which is of importance. What is environmental racism? The idea that institutionalized racism resulted in racial minorities shouldering a disproportionately large share of environmental burdens. The term began to be used in the early 1980s with a growing realization that a disproportionately large number of hazardous waste sites, toxic landfills, polluting industries were located in neighborhoods demographically dominated by African American and poor people. So basically they pointed out that look, when it comes to finding the location of polluting factories, of toxic landfills, of hazardous waste sites and of other kinds of environmentally harmful features and facilities, why is it that only those localities which are dominated by either racial minorities like African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans or by poor people, why is it that it is only such neighborhoods which are selected? Different definitions were given of environmental racism. Let's take a look at one of those definitions. Environmental racism is defined as racial discrimination in environmental policy making and the unequal enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. It is the deliberate targeting of people of color communities for toxic waste facilities and the official sanctioning of a life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in people of color communities. It is also manifested in the history of excluding people of color from the leadership of the environmental movement. Now, look at the last line of the definition I just told you. It talks about the leadership of movements. Why? Because the earlier environmental movements, be they the preservationist or conservationist movements or the movements about air and water pollution, were largely dominated by middle-class white American citizens. And I'm saying American citizens again because the context of the rise of environmental justice was the United States of America. One event which really served as a turning point was what is called the Warren County protests. This single incident pitchforked the question of environmental justice not just into the American national imagination, but into the imagination of environmental movements the world over. So what happened in this episode of environmental protest? Let's take a look. Warren County is one of the poorest counties in North Carolina state of the US. In terms of per capita income, at the time, it ranked 97th out of 100 counties in North Carolina. 64% of Warren County residents were African American. The county was chosen as the location of a landfill where 40,000 cubic yards of soil contaminated by PCBs or polychlorinated biphenyls would be dumped. It was clear that the landfill did not fulfill certain crucial assumptions and stipulations of the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA of the United States. What were these violations? Firstly, the landfill was such that it was very clear that the toxic waste would leach into the neighboring soil. Secondly, the EPA also had a stipulation that the water table must be at least 50 feet below the lower edge of the landfill. In this case, it was just 7 feet. So it was another major violation. Despite extensive protest and mobilization by African American resident groups in Warren County against the landfill, the North Carolina government decided to go ahead with it in 1979. In September 1982, when the trucks carrying the contaminated soil reached the county, hundreds of residents and activists lay down in the path of the trucks. Though the landfill was ultimately set up and the movement did not succeed in preventing it, the Warren County protests highlighted the case of environmental justice and led to intensified exploration of the links between environment, race, and class. So yes, the movement failed, and the movement also met with tremendous repression. So in September, more than 500 residents of Warren County were arrested and put behind bars. But despite this, what Warren County did was that it enabled African American communities in America, who had till then been rallying around the question of social justice as a part of the civil liberties movement, to come out openly against environmental degradation. In a sense, the Warren County protest signifies the first powerful coming together of questions of environmental protection and social justice. The next event was that a large number of studies now began to be carried out on the question of environmental justice, on the question of where toxic facilities, where landfills, where polluting factories were located, and was it indeed the case that there was a bias in favor of locating these environmentally problematic facilities in areas dominated by people of color or the poor. One such study is worthwhile to look at. In 1987, the Commission on Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ brought out its report, and that report received a tremendous amount of publicity. The report said a number of things. For example, 3 things. Firstly, that people of color were twice as likely as white people to live in a neighborhood having a hazardous waste site. Secondly, they are 3 times as likely to live in a community with more than one hazardous waste site. This report created ripples across the American public sphere. And in the wake of this report, a large number of researchers across universities, across environmental activist groups, and across civil liberties groups began to conduct their own research. This research also increasingly became accompanied by the formation of groups, of activist groups, exclusively dedicated to the question of environmental justice. The first landmark in this path towards rising mobilization on environmental justice question was a certain conference. It's important to look at what this conference says. It took place in 1991 in Washington, D.C. It's called the First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. It was attended by more than 500 people from various ethnic, cultural, environmental, and other activist groups. Very importantly, Okay, there were a number of things that the conference came up with, but very, very importantly, it formulated the 17 principles of environmental justice. The principles affirm several things, including the right to be free from ecological destruction, public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all peoples, the right to ethical, balanced and responsible uses of land, strict enforcement of principles of informed consent. You see, in this set of principles itself, we find the germ of a number of things which would later dominate discussions on environmental justice. For instance, informed consent, something that we'll come to in the next part. In summary, the environmental justice movement represents a coming together of the previously independent environmental movement on the one hand and social justice, civil liberty movements on the other. There was a tremendous churning, particularly amongst racial minorities in the United States, on the perception that in a large number of cases, environmentally harmful facilities like toxic landfills, like polluting factories, like sites of nuclear reactors were located in neighborhoods, in areas dominated either by communities of color like African Americans or by the poor. Environmental justice movement emerges in an attempt to blend this question of social injustice, this question of social inequity with the larger question of environmental protection.